The story of how my family left me to see if I could find my way after a card with the inscription, "I hope you make the right decision." My birthday has always been a special holiday for my family. Every year we gathered around a big table, celebrating an important event in my life. This time everything seemed familiar. But something was completely different. My family was there, as always: mom, dad, sister, and brother. Everyone smiled, congratulated, but I felt that something had changed. This day was supposed to be my holiday, but I couldn't shake the feeling that everything around me was alien. I received gifts that seemed ordinary. However, one of them caught my attention. It was a card, placed simply on a plate, and its inscription was a complete shock to me. "I hope you make the right decision," it read. There were no captions, just these words that kept running through my head, over and over again. I picked it up and looked at my family. Everyone was smiling, but for some reason I felt that their eyes didn't have the warmth I was used to seeing. My mother always greeted me with love, but today I noticed a chill in her gaze. My father just nodded his head slightly, as if not wanting to go into details. My sister and brother seemed to be on their own wavelength and weren't paying attention to me. Although that wasn't typical of them. I had the feeling that I was missing something, that they were looking at me differently. But what exactly? What could have changed their attitude towards me in one day? I couldn't get rid of that card all evening. It seemed so strange. I found it hard to breathe as I tried to understand why the family that had always been my support had suddenly become so distant. Why was this not just a greeting, but an important message? What decision did I need to make? And why couldn't I shake this feeling? I wasn't sure, but some kind of anxiety was stirring inside me that wouldn't let me rest. The night became difficult. The postcard, like a nightmare, wouldn't leave me. It seemed to be standing in front of me, like a challenge. Why was this feeling of making the right decision so important? I lay in bed, tossing and turning, but nothing could soothe this pain, this discomfort. I began to remember everything: my childhood, the years when my family and I laughed, cooked dinners together, planned vacations. But now I felt like a stranger. Everything around me was not the same as before. In the morning I woke up with the feeling that everything had changed. I couldn't understand why I was so unnecessary in my family. What had happened? Why wasn't there any conversation about why I was being greeted like that? I began to think that perhaps I had done something wrong. But what decision should I have made? And was there anything I could have changed? My family acted as if nothing had happened. My mother offered to help me around the house, my father continued to do his own things, my brother and sister did not even notice my anxiety. They did not seem to be worried at all. It was their usual routine, but I began to feel that they lived in their own world, and I seemed to have become part of something else. What was this strange situation? I could not find an answer. I returned to that card. It was the most important thing to me at that moment. And that was when I realized that it was not just a message or a remark. It was something more, like a final signal, a final attempt by the family to say something that they could not put into words. All these years I had been trying to understand where I belonged in the family, but now everything became clear. I was not part of their world in the way I had thought. I decided not to wait and not to take this situation passively. I had to find out why they remained indifferent. In the evening, after everyone had gone to bed, I decided to take the first step. I gathered a few of my things and went to my parents' office. It was a familiar path for me. I often came here looking for documents or just thinking. Now it became a place where I found answers to the questions that tormented me. My hand touched the table where photographs, books, and other little things usually stood. I took a few letters, laid them out in a row, but among them I found one that particularly caught my attention. It was an old letter, already somewhat yellowed, with the signature "You must make the right choice." This letter was not written by me. It was the same phrase that appeared in my postcard, and it was here that I realized that everything had been prepared much earlier than I could have imagined. It was more than just a birthday greeting, it was a code the family was using to try to convey important information to me. Later I realized that the decision I had to make was not about how I would live my life, but that my place in the family had already been decided in advance. They did not want me to be part of this story anymore. My role was excluded from their lives, even if I continued to exist in their house. The family had no intention of talking to me openly. They decided that I would no longer be a member of this circle, and that is why everything became so foreign to me. All these years I had believed that I had a right to my place, that my presence was wanted and welcomed. But now I understood that this was simply my belief. In the morning I got out of bed, gathered a few things, took one last look at this house where I had spent my childhood. I could no longer be a part of this place. I no longer had a connection to my family, a connection I had once considered unbreakable. I was leaving this house not because I wanted to, but because I had to. I was leaving him because the family's decision was final. And I was no longer part of their story. I gathered my things and headed for the door. At that moment, I felt my feet step over the threshold, leaving everything behind. I was free, but this state of freedom did not bring me joy. It was a liberation from what I had once considered home, but now I realized that I was only an outside observer in my own life. The feeling of emptiness remained, but I knew that this was my choice. I was not going to seek understanding or forgiveness. I moved on, leaving behind the same postcard that would forever remain a mystery to me. Had I made the right decision? Maybe so, but I remained free and independent, even if it meant saying goodbye to what I had once considered family. The days that I spent after leaving my family were hazy. I wandered around the city, trying to figure out what to do next. The first days of freedom felt like comfort, but quickly this illusion dissipated. The world became empty, and I didn't know what to fill this space with. I didn't look for anyone, I didn't turn to friends, I didn't try to return. All those memories of family, of home, of breakfasts and evenings that I once lived, now looked like only photographs in a closet. I didn't turn to my relatives and didn't receive any messages from them. Only once in all that time did I receive a letter from my mother, in which she wrote briefly, "We need to talk." These words were almost like an order, and they scared me. I didn't answer. But something inside me began to change. I felt that all this was only the beginning. I had an irresistible need to understand why this had happened. Why I had become superfluous in my life, and why I was not part of the family, despite all the years I had given it. I returned to the old house, but this time I was no longer the same. I was not the son, I was not the brother. I was a stranger, and it became obvious to everyone. I tried to find answers among the papers that remained in my father's office. And again the letters, again the documents, but this time I was looking for more than just traces of their past. I was looking for an explanation. And it was in this that I found what changed everything. One of the letters that I accidentally found among the old accounting books was addressed to a lawyer. It said that the family had decided to divide the property before I had even taken my first steps. I realized that Everything had been decided long before I had even thought about my rights and possibilities. I was simply part of a plan, to be only what they wanted me to be. I felt a new wave of anger rising. I was not part of this plan. My story was not built on my actions or desires, but on the convenience of others. I understood that I no longer needed anything from them. Everything I did was for myself. They simply left me behind because it was more convenient. But this moment was the beginning of my new path. I didn't need any more proof. I already knew everything. I decided to return to my life. I was no longer looking for an answer, I was my own answer. I was no longer just a bystander in someone else's story. Now it was my own story, where I decided what to do next. All those thoughts and questions I had carried inside me disappeared when I decided to start everything from scratch. I may not have been part of their family, but now I was part of something bigger, my own story. My freedom became my strength. But despite this, I still felt that there was something unsettled. I knew that it was not over yet. Time passed. I gradually got used to the new reality, although somewhere inside me there remained that incomprehensible emptiness that could not be filled by new acquaintances, by work, or even by numerous trips. All these things seemed like temporary distractions. More was needed than just leaving the past behind. One day, as I wandered the streets of the city, my thoughts returned to my family again. This time I was no longer looking for an answer. I was simply overcome by the realization that this past, this thing I had once left behind, was no longer reachable. But that did not mean that it had no impact. I felt that I was left with an unpaid debt to myself. So I decided to return to that house. My visit to the old house was unannounced. I arrived in the morning, without a plan or a specific destination. The house was empty, but that didn't surprise me. They had moved. I knew that when I packed up my things. I was prepared to find nothing. But every time I tried to let go of that moment, I was drawn back to that place. One day, I walked into the room where my desk had once been. Everything looked just as I remembered it, but nothing warmed me. Just a cold, empty space that was no longer mine. After a few minutes of thought, I decided to go see the lawyer I had worked with before when we were doing various paperwork. I needed to find out if there was anything else I didn't know. I knew that something might have been left out, or, as I thought at the time, something might have been missed. But the lawyer wasn't who I expected. He looked nervous and unpleasantly surprised when I walked into his office. His reaction was so strong that it surprised me. Then I realized that what I was looking for could be much more significant than I had assumed. He said that there were some new details that were not part of the previous discussion, but I should have known them. The lawyer's words somehow fell out of his mouth mechanically, as if it were just part of his job, but I heard something important in them. It turned out that my family had long begun the process of redistributing their property. And it had all been planned for many years. My role in this scheme was the same as always, to be the one who follows the path that they had paved for me. And that was when I first realized that I was not the only puppet in the hands of others. It turned out that they themselves were part of a larger game, where all their decisions had long been determined by other people. Every step, every decision they made was not theirs, but was dictated by external factors that I now had a chance to understand. But there was one question that remained unanswered: why? Why was my role so small in this big picture? Why had I become not just invisible, but unimportant? What had made them decide this way? It wasn't an accident. Maybe I just didn't want to see it. But the answer still wasn't clear. The same lawyer I spoke to couldn't give me a clear explanation. But he told me one thing that stuck in my mind for a long time. He said there was one more detail I had to learn if I was to understand why it had all happened this way. But to do that, I needed to go back to the place I had fled from. And that became another part of the bigger picture that was getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And bigger and bigger and bigger. These moments were turning points. They forced me to go back to what I had given up. But now that I was back, I was not who I had been before. I was different. And I couldn't ignore these changes. Now my task was clear, to find out what had really happened in that house and why I had so easily become part of someone else's game. I returned to the house that had once been my home. Everything seemed completely different now. Maybe it was just my own change, but I no longer saw the place the way I had before. Its walls no longer brought a sense of warmth, and instead everything seemed cold and alien. I didn't know what awaited me, but the feeling that it would be something important was very strong. After I contacted a lawyer and learned about the property, my desire to return to these places became even more irresistible. I needed to understand why everything had happened this way. As it turned out, a lot had changed since I had disappeared from their lives. My parents had started a new life, changing all their plans and moving in a different direction. They were no longer the people I knew. It took several days before I was able to return there. All this time, I had been running through countless possibilities in my head of what I might find. However, I was not prepared for what would actually happen when I was re-entered this shadowy part of my past. When I arrived at the old house, everything seemed very quiet. The back door was closed, and there was no movement through the windows. I stood and just stared at this place that had once been my home for a few minutes. Nothing had changed on the outside, but I felt that something big was hiding me inside. I pushed on the door and it opened to my surprise. I entered the room again, where everything was so familiar. I had spent so much time here, and it seemed as if all these memories were still hanging in the air. I started searching through the old things. I didn't find anything special, but with each passing minute I felt that something was wrong. After a while, I found some old documents in one of the tables. They were papers that I didn't remember seeing before. They belonged to my family, but their content was completely incomprehensible. Among these documents, I found what looked like some important notes, which indicated changes in property, agreements that I couldn't even imagine. Then I realized that my parents had not only prepared everything to leave me behind, but had also manipulated the situation in such a way that I couldn't even understand the full picture. I started looking through these papers one by one. This was the beginning of a grand scheme they had devised for themselves to consolidate their power and distribute all their wealth. It seemed as if they had been doing this for years, planning every step. I was not part of their world, and this was supposed to be the final sign for me. But there was still one thing that puzzled me. Among these documents I found another card. It was similar to the one they had given me for my birthday. But this card did not have the same inscription on it. It looked very old, but it had the same signature as the first letter. It turned out that the card was not just a gift, but a certain part of the plan they were trying to implement. This was the stage when I should have understood that I was really just a part of their plans, not the person they wanted in their lives. These documents became the key to my final understanding. I saw that everything had been planned, every step, every movement. It was all part of a big game, and I was just a link in this mechanism. However, all of that mattered less now. I understood that I was being left behind, and would never be a part of what they were building. Now it was time for me to move on. With the documents in my hands, I left this house, feeling that all of this was nothing more than a part of the past that needed to be left behind. All these plans, all these conspiracies, this was no longer my path. I decided to move forward, leaving all of this behind. I decided that this was my last day in this city. I might not be able to understand all of these circumstances and secrets that surrounded me, but I was not ready to stay here any longer. Everything that connected me to this family no longer mattered. I was not looking for any more explanations, I was not looking for the truth. I was only looking for a way to regain my freedom to move on, and that was the only thing that made sense. I put the documents in my bag and went to the old house to pick up the last things. The moment when we first arrived here was in my memories. Then it was a place that was to be our home forever. And, it seems, for the first time I felt that I was leaving this house for the last time. When I got back to the house, I noticed a few things I hadn't noticed before. The kitchen door was battered, as if someone had been out too often and forgotten to close it properly. On the table was one of those old photos of us together before everything changed. And I realized that it didn't even matter how much longer I spent here, because these memories no longer belonged to me. They belonged to someone else. The person I had been before all this happened. I stood among familiar walls, gathering up the last of my belongings, feeling every object in this room become foreign. All those years, all those efforts I had put in, no longer had any meaning to them. They had left me behind. Left me with no chance of returning. The choice had been made, and I had to accept it. I got in my car and drove off in a direction I had never planned for myself. The path was open. And I felt free, but also empty. What would I do next? Could I really start a new life? Everything was so unclear. I had driven a few miles, and suddenly I felt something extraordinary. As if this trip had not been just a trip. It was the moment when I finally broke free from the circle I had been in for so many years. I didn't know where I was going. But I increasingly realized that wherever I went, it would be my choice, my path. Every time I drove through familiar places, it seemed like I was finally losing what had once been mine. And the further I drove, the more I felt that every step was a step into the unknown. I had lost touch with the past. Now I had to move forward, not even knowing what lay ahead. I didn't try to turn back. I decided that there was no point. I had become part of a world that was far from me. Time passed, and I realized that I was no longer the person I had been before. And although I didn't know exactly where I was going, I felt that changes had already happened. And I was no longer the person my family wanted me to be. At that moment, when I had reached a considerable distance, I realized that turning back was not an option. My journey mattered. This was my chance to build a new life, to start all over again. I decided to leave the past behind and do everything I could to feel free for the first time in many years. But when I stopped at a small gas station on the side of the road and smelled the fresh air, I realized that the real journey is not where you are going, but what you are leaving behind. I made the decision to move forward, without looking back. And although I did not know what awaited me ahead, I felt that I could finally be myself. My new life began with simple things. I stayed for a few days in a small town that had few tourists and seemed to have no time left. It was a place I could afford, a place without a past, without a family, without any obligations. I stayed in an old apartment with only one window overlooking a small square where the locals gathered in the evenings. The silence was different here. Here I didn't feel like a stranger, only someone trying to start over. I spent the first week getting used to being alone. All the habits that had been part of my life before seemed to have no meaning in this new world. I went for walks around the town, checking out the little shops that sold everything from old books to antiques. I began to feel what it was like to be a part of this place, as if it were my new home. But despite the outward sense of peace, inside I was empty. I realized that even though I was starting from scratch, I still carried with me questions that haunt me. What happened to my family? Why didn't they stop me? Didn't they at least try to explain their decision? And most importantly, was it all their fault, or did I have some role in what happened? Every time I went to a cafe or for a walk, I was struck by one thought: my old acquaintances did not know what had happened. For them, I was just a person who had suddenly disappeared, and they continued their lives without me. It was like a part of an old movie where the audience had forgotten about the main character. My relatives and acquaintances now lived with other worries and did not remember me. I realized that they could not and did not want to understand why I had done this. The days passed, and I felt more and more how my life was becoming distant from what it was before. I began to find new opportunities for myself, opening doors that had long been closed. I signed up for photography courses, made new acquaintances, and even started writing short reflections. That helped me understand myself better. One day I received a letter. I could not believe my eyes when I saw that it was from my sister. The letter was short and seemed to make no sense. She wrote that everyone wants me back and that it wasn't right what happened. I didn't reply. All these years, everything they had done couldn't be erased with a single letter. It seems they finally understood that I had not disappeared for nothing, but it was too late. You can't turn back time. But still, when I discovered this new world for myself, I understood one important thing: I had begun to live. This was my real freedom. I wasn't looking for a return, I wasn't trying to recover what had been lost. I simply became a part of this world, letting go of the past. My family was not something I could take care of anymore. I had found a new path and, although it was uncertain, it was mine. Over time, I stopped looking at the past. I didn't look for answers to the questions that had once tormented me. I no longer expected anyone to understand why I had left. My story became a story that I wrote myself. And although life gave me fewer and fewer chances to return to what was, I felt that this was how I was meant to be. I was no longer a person who could ever be simply left behind. I became part of that new life in which everything began from a clean slate, without looking back. And now, as I stood on the border between the past and the future, I understood one thing: in the end, I myself became the creator of my own future.